Welcome to Truth Watchers. I am Heath Henning. The book of Job, chapter 41, mentions the creature Leviathan. Have you ever wondered what this was all about? Many commentators suggest it is a mythical creature. Others suggest, and this is becoming more popular it seems, that Leviathan is to depict a polemic against a pagan myths of chaos. Many ancient Near Eastern myths depict a sea monster that represents chaos, and the Bible, placing God as mightier than Leviathan, is allegedly an attack or a polemic against this pagan mythic creature to show God is in control. This is more often discussed in context of Genesis 1, which I'll have to discuss on a different video, but I would reject these various views. I think it is clear that from the context of the book of Job, chapters 38 through 41, this is an actual living creature that Job was personally acquainted with. Looking at these chapters, we see that God speaks of various literal animals. The only ones that produce any question are the behemoth and Leviathan. Behemoth is said to drink up the Jordan in Job 40, verse 23. So this was a local creature that Job was aware of personally. This likely refutes the idea of Behemoth being a hippopotamus, but the whole purpose of the questions God proposes to Job is to ask if Job understands the physical creation. Why would God begin to incorporate non existing mythological creatures as the last two creatures he questions Job about? How would that help God's argument as he interrogates Job? Michael V. Fox, a liberal scholar, wrote an article on Behemoth and Leviathan, which I would reject his conclusions. However, he states, quote, nor is Leviathan in the theophany the chaos monster known from Northwest Semitic mythology, though that is the idea of Leviathan that Job himself holds. Leviathan in the theophany is incompatible with what we know of the mythical monster, which had multiple heads and was serpentine. Unquote. This is a good example of how liberals will view the Bible as incorporating ancient Near Eastern myths from Fox citations of Psalm 74 and Isaiah 27. We should reject this opinion of mythology in the Bible, and it is questionable that any passages in the Bible incorporates myths for polemic reasons. But what is notable here is that even this liberal scholar indicates that Job is not using a mythic expression, though Fox thinks Job himself held such an idea. God speaking to Job clearly was not holding a mythic idea. Fox argues that Behemoth was a hippo and Leviathan was either a crocodile or a whale. I will add this thought, however. In ancient Jewish non-canonical literature, Leviathan takes on a mythic proportion. Jews of later time period, after the Old Testament, clearly were more synchronistic with cultures around them, although the Jews always were synchronistic, which is evident in the Old Testament because they frequently worship idols of the other nations around them. In the Second Temple and Rabbinic period, they maintained a strict monotheism, but synchronized ideas of myths from surrounding cultures. But let's look at Leviathan and glean some insights from this creature. First, we find Leviathan is a sea creature. This is evident from the first verse of chapter 41. Quote, canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Unquote. In verses 31 through 32, it speaks of the paths in the deep, which he lights up and makes the water to boil. So this is obviously a sea creature of some sort. It does seem like it can come onto land and perhaps breathe air. In verse 26, it speaks of one not able to raise a sword or spear against Leviathan. That would seem to depict a battle taking place on land. Verse 4 asks, quote, "Wilt thou take him for a servant forever?" Unquote. And in verse 13 it is asked, quote, "Who can come to him with his double bridle?" Unquote. These two expressions, taken together, seem to depict one harnessing the creature to serve like an ox or horse, maybe to plow a field, with a bridle in its mouth to direct it. Leviathan is depicted as invincible, with skin or scales, more specifically, that are impenetrable. Verse 2 says, quote, "Canst thou put an hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn?" Unquote. This and the following question are obviously rhetorical questions that imply it is impossible to pierce this creature's hide. Likewise, in verse 7, we read, quote, "Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears?" Unquote. The Hebrew word for skin here would depict skin or hide. This could just be used as a general term since other verses speak of scales. For example, verses 15 through 17 states, quote, "His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so near to another that no error can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together that they cannot be sundered." Unquote. Again, in verse 23, it states, quote, "The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves. They cannot be moved." Unquote. These verses would have caused Michael V. Fox to reject the opinion that Leviathan was a whale. I would suggest that the description is closer to what we know as some sort of dinosaur. I say this because the scales are presented as a tough hide that provide armor for this creature. I am putting on the screen some images of dinosaur scales that clearly depict the image of armor. As we think about a whale, they surely do not have scales, nor is their skin armor of any sorts. Just look at this image closely. Some dinosaurs with scales were attacked and eaten because they didn't have this kind of armor to protect them. Here is another example. Here I put a picture of a crocodile along with the image of fossilized armor from a dinosaur. I picked this image of the croc purposely because it looks more similar to the armored dinosaur hide. However, if we think about a crocodile, they do have scales, but who would be willing to think of a crocodile as having an invincible or impenetrable scales? Scales of fish or crocodiles are not armored like we find on these dinosaurs. I think the Leviathan is more fitting description of a dinosaur of some sort. He is also described as able to breathe fire. A lot of commentators will try to explain this as poetic metaphorical language. Job is a poem. However, when we look at the former discussions of animals in the previous chapters, we find no language that is not intended to be understood as literal. In this poem, it is describing literal animals with literal abilities. It is common in poetry to find hyperboles. For example, the behemoth drinketh up a river in Job 40, verse 23, which seems to describe an enormous creature drinking the whole river. It doesn't need to be interpreted that way, but at first glance, that is what it appears like. Setting the hyperbole aside, the action of drinking from the river is a literal ability of the behemoth. Similarly, I would suggest the Leviathan breathing fire may be depicted with hyperbole, but it is still a literal ability of this creature. Notice what it says on the topic of Leviathan. Job 41, verses 18 through 21 says, quote, "By his neesings a light doth shine, and his eyes like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. Unquote. Michael V. Fox suggested the whale blowing vapors out of its blowhole could be viewed as smoke out of its nostril, or if seen in the sunshine, it could be imagined as fire. This would be a far-fetched stretch for what we are reading in Job. Besides, in verse 31 through 32, we read, quote, He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like the pot of ointment. He maketh a path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. Unquote. Here we have the water which begins to boil, and it seems to describe the breath of fire under water making a path shine, and the deep hoary. Hoary is the word depicting gray hair on the old men, which seems to me to present perhaps ashes or flashes of whiteness occurring deep underwater. A fire-breathing creature may seem mythic to many people, but if we think about this a little deeper, there is really no reason to not believe this is a real ability of a real creature that existed near the location Job lived. Many discuss the bombardier beetle. This little beetle has chemicals inside different chambers, which, when combined, can explosively fire out bursts of gas over 200 degrees as a defense mechanism from its rear end. This is a very fascinating little beetle to study. Many scientists have discussed this beetle to refute evolution because there is no imaginable intermediate stage of evolution for this creature. However, we don't need to go to this beetle to find something that provides evidence for an animal that can produce fire. The bombardier beetle doesn't actually produce a flammable gas, just something super hot. But consider humans. We produce flammable gas. It does not come out of our mouth, but like the beetle, it comes out of the other end. It is a flammable gas produced in our digestive system. No, we do not use this as a defense mechanism. The skunk does use spray from its rear end for defense. I don't think the skunk is flammable, but it does burn, especially the eyes. My point is, humans do produce flammable gas that comes out of our digestive system. Also, cows produce flammable gas. Cows produce flammable gas, methane, in their first stomach compartment called the rumen, where microbes ferment their food. This process, known as enteric fermentation, breaks down tough plant material like grass into a form the cow can absorb. The methane gas is then primarily expelled by the cow through belching. This gas causes bloating for the cow. You can find videos of farmers tapping the cow to release the gas and lighting it on fire. But imagine if there was a source to ignite the gas as it comes out as a burp. In this sense, a cow has the potential to breathe fire. That's something to think about. I would also speculate, since we know that many birds and fish swallow stones to help pulverize food in their stomachs, if these stones functioned as a flint causing sparks, it could be released out of the mouth as fire or smoke. Just logically speaking, a fire-breathing creature is not all that obscene to think of, especially since we know some water types of dinosaurs have been discovered to have stones in their stomachs. Carl Whelan's book, Dragons of the Deep, states on page 36, quote, Plesiosaurs, such as Sicosaurus, have been found with many gastroliths, stomach stones, inside their abdomen. These are real rocks that had been swallowed by the creature. When found today, they can often be highly polished from having been tumbled in this way. Many types of birds and reptiles swallow stones to help them digest food by grinding it inside the stomach. Often hundreds, sometimes thousands of these stones are found in association with plesiosaur remains. Some crocodiles swallow stones as ballast to counter their own buoyancy, causing them to sink. Then they vomit them up as required. This regurgitation at will would probably have been difficult for a creature with a neck this long, even though the combined weight of the stones found in association with one plesiosaur is often well over 100 pounds. This is still not much compared to the overall size of the animal, so they were probably not used as ballast, but to grind the plesiosaur's meals. Unquote. The plesiosaur is what a lot of people would think of as the Loch Ness monster. I mentioned that just to identify that the idea of such a creature living today is not outside of pop culture, although I don't think they had the type of scales or armor that would properly depict what the Leviathan was. Other descriptions portray Leviathan as fierce and something to be greatly feared. Job 41, verses 8 through 10 states, quote, "Lay thine hand upon him, remember the battle, do no more. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down even at the sight of him? None is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me?" Unquote. Whatever this animal was, it was large, fierce, and intimidating. It has armor like scales and breathes fire. Verse 25 illustrates this, quote, "When he raises up himself, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breakings, they purify themselves." Here is one of those verses I think gives us reason to believe that God has a sense of humor. The mighty men who stand before the Leviathan is said to purify themselves by reason of breaking forth. This, put politely, is the great warriors wetting their pants when they see the Leviathan. This is a frightening creature. No man can stand before it. But all the animals discussed in Job are mentioned for a purpose, for us to learn lessons. Leviathan is no different. The chapter ends by saying, quote, "Upon earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. He beholdeth all high things. He is a king over all the children of pride." Unquote. All the mighty men might think they're tough until they meet this Leviathan. He is the king over anything that thinks proudly of itself. I think of videos I've seen of honey badgers. These little things are so tough, they will try to attack a pride of lions. It will be outnumbered and obviously much smaller than the lions, but it won't back down from the fight. It's too proud for its own good. But the Leviathan is king of all such children of pride, including man. Yet Leviathan is a created creature. God created it. As God said about Behemoth, quote, "He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him." Unquote. He that made Leviathan can approach him with a sword also. In the broader context of Job, it was Job's friends that spoke wrong things about God, as the Lord rebuked them in chapter 42, verse 7. Man is afraid of created things like Leviathan, but are unfearful of God, who is mightier than all. God is the creator, the Almighty. The book of Job is structured in a large chiastic format, with chapter 28 right in the middle, making it the pivot point and central message of the whole book. Chapter 28 discusses wisdom being more valuable than all the precious metals or gems found in the earth. We are to search after wisdom, not gold or other elements of value. But the chapter closes with saying, quote, "And unto man he said, Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding." Unquote. This verse is structured to present wisdom and understanding as parallels, as well as fear of the Lord being paralleled with departing from evil. In other words, our lesson from Leviathan would be if man is smart enough to be afraid of this fierce creature, it is greater wisdom to fear the Lord. It is the fear of the Lord that is defined as departing from evil. God's judgment is so much worse than anything this Leviathan could do to us, yet man does not depart from evil, which brings God's wrath upon us. We show more fear of created things than we do of the Creator himself. Where's the wisdom in that? Does the idea of offending a holy God frighten you? Does sin sound so scary that you wet your pants at the mere thought of disobeying God's law? The reality is, we are all probably more fearful of a crocodile or hippo, but the behemoth and Leviathan were much more larger and fearful. And God is greater than all these created things. We should be more fearful of offending God with our sin than any animal, no matter how fierce it may be. This is Heath Henning. Thank you for tuning into Truth Watchers podcast. Remember to hit the subscribe button and share it with a friend. For more fascinating facts, check us out at truthwatchers.com because sound apologetics and exegesis of scriptures is important for all of God's children, as it is indicated in 3 John verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.